First of all, so my name is Janalyn Guo, and I'm the business manager and creative nonfiction acquisitions editor at the University of Utah Press. And I'm going to be introducing Joanne today. And
Okay.
all right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be here today to celebrate the launch of Every Last Breath, a Memoir of Two Illnesses by Joanne Jacobson. Big congratulations to you, Joanne.
Thank you.
So first, I just want to briefly introduce the University of Utah Press to those of you here who aren't familiar with us. We are based in Salt Lake City. We publish between 25 and 30 titles per year in a number of subject areas, including anthropology, archaeology, American Indian studies, Western history, poetry, and of course, creative nonfiction and memoir. At this time, we have more than 500 titles currently in print. We are a small staff of 7 who wear many hats. In attendance today is our director and editor-in-chief, Glenda Cotter, as well as our sorry, I forgot to let you say hi, as well as our marketing manager, Hannah New.
Hello.
She organized this virtual launch, so thank you, Hannah. And now moving on to what everyone is here for tonight. I have my book right here, Every Last Breath. Everyone, one. In Every Last Breath, Jacobson starts out closely observing and writing about her mother's respiratory illness, but is soon interrupted by her own diagnosis with an extremely rare blood disorder. What follows is an ever-widening meditation on chronic illness, how it blurs the distinction between illness and wellness, and what it means to be called out of the world we count on and flung back into the wilderness of our bodies. I am so pleased that Every Last Breath is out in the world today. I've read this book a handful of times now, and it floors me every time with its wisdom and insight and depth of attention to the mortal body and the natural world, interwoven by both strangeness and beauty. Joanne Jacobson is with us tonight, along with special guest Stephen Donadio. I'm going to read you a brief bio for both of them and hand it off to Joanne, who will read an excerpt from Every Last Breath, and a discussion between Joanne and Stephen Donadio will follow. Joanne Jacobson is the author of Authority and Alliance in the Letters of Henry Adams and Hunger Artist, A Suburban Childhood. Her critical essays and memoirs have appeared in such publications as Bellevue Literary Review, New England Review, Fourth Genre, and The Nation, and her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies. Stephen Donadio was for 20 years the editor of the New England Review, where he still serves as editor at large. He is the Fulton Professor Emeritus of Humanities at Middlebury College and a longtime continuing member of the faculty at the Breadloaf Graduate School of English. One final thing, there will be time for audience questions after the discussion. We've got the questions you submitted beforehand, and feel free to enter any questions you have as they come up in the chat box here in the Zoom box anytime during the night. Thank you for being here, and congratulations to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Janalyn. Thanks so much to everyone. These turn out to be events that pull together so many great people from one's past in a way that's so powerful. I do want to thank the University of Utah Press for being such a great press to work with, particularly Janalyn for everything she's done on behalf of this book, and to Hannah for promoting this launch, and so much more. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Stephen Donadio, for being such an important part of my writing life for so many years, and of course for generously participating in this launch tonight. I'm going to start tonight by reading, I think it'll be about 15 minutes altogether, brief selections from 5 of the essays of Every Last Breath. And my intention is to try to provide both an overview of the trajectory of the book, but also a sense of the rhythm back and forth between my mother's illness and my own illness, between breath and blood. And if it turns out that people want to talk later about my specific illness, TTP, then we can talk about that later. I'm actually not going to provide a lot of details about that now. So, this is the title essay, Every Last Breath. In the high quiet above the earth, migrating birds can hear life itself, the beat of wings and of breath taking them to where there is food and where they can breathe, the cycle beginning again every year. They sweep the sky in flocks so thick that they shadow the land below. The monarch butterfly, 1/5 of an ounce, finds its way the length of the continent north to south, fueled by air, sweet air setting wafer wings in vibration. From every room in her apartment, I can hear my mother's breath, the steady hiss of force, not her own, drawing from tubes and canisters in the interstices of television sound. Clear plastic is clipped in her nostrils, crossing her face. Tubing curls and uncurls in her wake. She turns and whips the knotting line behind her, tangling, untangling and clearing, making her careful way from the hall to the kitchen. She is feeding on oxygen. Her breath used to quicken in the summer sun as she inhaled in even gulps between sets of tennis, balancing casually on the handle of her racket. What required air, she could easily do. Take the green lawn with the mower in long circling rows, leaving stacked clippings drying behind her in the heat. Rake the heavy leaves to the curb at the chill, wet end of autumn. Paint the kitchen walls, unload groceries from the car, lug bags up the sidewalk from the garage, jam open the screen door with one crooked arm while she balanced a sack of canned soup and frozen vegetables and a half-gallon of skim milk with the other. She'd wait for my little sister to climb the back steps one by one, and then steer her through the spring door that strained against her own back. Scoot. My mother's oxygen is delivered now, pumped into a green drum half my height in the front hall. She fills a canister when she leaves the house and straps it to her back, counting the minutes. Breathing has become work. She crosses slowly to the window every morning, laying down a cord trail behind her bathrobe, and pours seed for the birds that wait at her feeder. In her little yard, cardinals and jays screech and flicker, bold red and blue above the ragged lawn. They dive and grab for what my mother gives them, recklessly leaving a cloud of discarded husks, squandering the fresh air. And from the essay, Mirror Writing. In April, my mother told me that what was making me sad was my own mortality. And by July, it turned out that she was right. I was rounding the corner on my 5th year of writing about my mother's chronic respiratory illness. And in a moment, without warning, I was facing the true fact that I could die before she did. My plan had been to follow my mother's illness in the present tense, so that I could draw closer to her while she was actually living end of life. I was hoping that by not waiting for the point when I could look back and read in reverse, I would create the potential for illumination. And indeed, the limitations of my own freshly 60-ish anxieties about aging have been revealed to me by the way my mother has lived these years. For she has remained determined to wring whatever pleasure she can from each day, rather than to peer ahead at death, a death that we all know could well take a painful, suffocating form. My mother has proved to be stubborn, sometimes hilariously so. When she had to move out of her apartment, she refused to relinquish her stockpile of plastic margarine containers and her collection of mock turtlenecks, including the stained ones that she pulled out of the donation pile, announcing that she would just wear those backwards. Yet she has also proved miraculously adaptable. She has faced and accepted 24/7 oxygen supplements, enduring the breathing cannula that hangs and hisses and makes her nose drip wherever she goes. She continues to play ping pong with a 5-pound oxygen tank slung across her chest. So I had been learning from this writing project and even acquiring an unanticipated humility. The effect of standing in attentive proximity to the unadorned courage required to live and to breathe every long day. And then suddenly, late one afternoon, words began to drift out of my mouth on a trajectory of their own. It seemed at first like a stroke, though I was still me enough to weep at the thought of being carried on a stretcher at rush hour into an elevator crowded with my neighbors. Over the next days, I would become unrecognizable to myself, a person diagnosed with a potentially fatal blood disorder, forever scarred where the flesh was cut and a tube for total plasma exchange jammed into my jugular vein. If I was now someone whose life had been saved, I was also now a patient, as chronically ill as my mother. This essay is called Written in Blood. Are you in pain? A nurse asks on my first morning in the hospital. Pain changes everything. I'm glad to be able to answer no, not only because I am relieved to not be suffering, but also because I am not ready to see myself in the hurting bodies of the patients all around me. Day and night, I can't help overhearing from the other side of the room, doctors telling other human beings that their lives will never be the same. That's a hard load you've given me, another roommate tells her young doctor in her lilting African accent. I'm not sure I know how to bear it. Would turning up the volume on my TV be disrespectful, or just the right signal to transmit over the airspace between us? My recognition that listening to this conversation is wrong. Good morning, Miss Joanne, the mother of yet another roommate, a young woman whose excruciating sickle cell anemia has relapsed, greets me. Scratching my dirty hair, outrageously bound in a bright pink band to secure heavy tubing to my head, I am disbelieving when I catch sight of myself in the mirror. If pebbles were hospitalized, I mentally titled this image. Who am I now? One night, an aide wakes me at 3 a.m. and packs up my small stash of belongings while I wrap my arms around myself in a hospital never-nightness, determined not to cry. They're moving me to the oncology ward, where the staff is better equipped to deal with my rare condition. I pad through the halls, wrapped in a pair of flimsy, wrinkled gowns, back to front, incompletely sealed, exchanging stories about the hospital food with other patients in the lounge. I am one of them now. I wear the same uniform as they do. My mother gardening. Can you see anything inside? His companions cried out to the archaeologist Howard Carter when he opened King Tut's tomb, secreted in the sands for 30 years. Yes, Carter called back, wonderful things. It was 2.5 years before my mother was born. All of Tut's organs, his heart and his liver, each kidney and his stomach, were embalmed and laid in stoppered canopic jars, then fitted into golden coffinettes. 30 jars of wine, 4 complete board games, 139 ebony, ivory, silver, and gold walking sticks, 50 linen garments, for the Egyptians believed that earthly human affairs continued in the afterlife, were preserved in the airless, crowded rooms. I wonder what my mother would wish to take with her on such a journey beyond time. Surely she would hope to leave behind the damaged lungs that slowed her down in her 80s, though she has already lived so much longer than the boy king, dead at 19. Without a doubt, she would have her Scrabble board folded up and set beside her, the soft cotton socks still filled with worn tiles, the little wooden racks on which she'd sorted and resorted so many letters, made so many words, her tennis racket, just in case strength and flexibility should be granted to her once again. And she'd want to take the flowers that she had graciously preserved all her life, gloriously preserved all her life, the light blue salvia that she'd grown and hung to dry in pipe cleanered bunches over the kitchen sink, the Queen Anne's lace that she'd collected on weekend walks in the country. She always saved the loveliest of the roses from gift bouquets and gently sank them one by one into finely sifted sand. When she drew them out, the fragile blossoms would be perfectly fixed, hovering forever at the grayish edge of pink. Wonderful things. Even today, when her movement must be frugal, her breath slowed, my mother seeks out her garden in the morning coolness. She carries a trowel and plastic bags from the grocery store that she saved to collect weeds and dead flowers. She pauses when she comes to the end of the path, assessing what has grown in the sun since the day before, and slowly circles her plantings. She does not think about dying, she tells me when I ask, nor does she think ahead many mornings beyond this one. My mother has no interest in death's deals, in giving up even a little of the time remaining to her in order to set aside beloved objects for a chanced afterlife, much less to furnish a lavish tomb, in sacrificing even for a moment the gift of now that she has been granted. She gently cups a low, fresh flower, something that wasn't open last time she worked in this modest garden. Isn't this what we all dream of? The promise of forever starting over, the human means of making new life and even beauty still close at hand? And finally, if my disease were an animal, what would it be? Would it be a bird of prey, an eagle dropping without warning from the sky, its talons, the surprising source of the great bird's power, gripping what's alive and taking it away? My disease finds me without warning, assailing me, throwing me on the defensive. No one knows its cause. In the emergency room, my clothes are taken from me, my blood drawn, the pumping of my heart measured from a flimsy cot, barely set off from others' raw animal cries. I will be wheeled again through dull, long corridors into the blinding lights of surgery, where a masked stranger will carve my living flesh, open a path into my warm throat, locate the blood circulating deep beneath the surface. Over the past years, I have been rewilded, forced to accept the animal truths of my human body. I've witnessed my own blood drained, exposed to day's light, mixed with the plasma of others, turning me back to the elemental rawness that few must face, much less see in themselves. My doctor presses the cold disc of his stethoscope over the thin fabric of my gown, listening for the brute animal heart. Just a beating thing, really, driven by surging blood and by the untamable urge to live. From the deck of a 19th century whaling ship, humans could see the big beasts riding the water, their flesh scarred by encounters with predators, beating maimed fins, dangling embedded harpoons. On their bodies, the relentless pitch of survival was made visible to the naked eye and the dark threat of the unknown. Though he survived his fall overboard into the roiling sea, Herman Melville's deck boy Pip was forever altered in Moby Dick by the sight of God's foot upon the treadle of the loom. Nor can I return to the certain, safe place I came from. 2 decades ago, I peered over the gritty rim of the universe at the Grand Canyon, into the void where what time and water can do, even to solid rock, is revealed. But I am no longer a tourist of boundaries. Illness is a wild dream, remote as the far edge of night from what we think we know. And when it envelops us, when it fogs and transforms ordinary life, we can only hope, I see now, to emerge a little more fully awake. Thank you.
It's my turn to say something, and I want to begin by saying that I am deeply grateful for the gift of having read this book, and really for the opportunity to talk with the author a little bit about it tonight. The pages that Joanne has chosen give you a sense of the themes of this book and the texture of the prose in it. But for those of you who haven't yet encountered the book, I want to begin by saying that it is a truly extraordinary work. Just over 100 pages. And the format in which it appears, it's relatively modest in size and quite carryable close to one's body, is not inconsequential and is in fact a significant indication of the work's distinguishing qualities. What Joanne has produced and provided us with is at once, as you can tell, an intensely intimate letter to the world and a book of hours which manages to itemize the familiar contents of the world in which we spend our days, including the plastic containers we store on our shelves, the leftovers in the refrigerator, the Scrabble tiles, and which also takes account of the ravages of time revealed by notations to be found in an old address book, crossed out names, half-forgotten relationships. Its unobtrusive but singularly concentrated movement from mundane particulars to patterns of overwhelming significance links this work with the defining achievements of American transcendentalism, works by Emerson, Whitman, Dickinson, Melville, as you've just heard. And it is Thoreau especially whose presence emerges repeatedly in these pages. So Joanne, I'm going to ask you, if you would, to say a word about Thoreau's influence, and to ask you also if there are other touch points that you discovered in the working through of this book, other writings that occurred to you as possible models or precedents for what you wanted to do.
Yeah, we touched a little bit on this the other day, and I have to say, I myself am surprised to see how consistently Thoreau rose to the surface in this work, how his concerns, I think, especially with cycles, with the movement of the seasons and the intimacy of living day by day in nature with animals, with the earth. And I think also the theme that I just touched on at the end of that reading, maybe one closer to Thoreau than to Melville, of awakening. And I wouldn't want to be someone who said, you know, looking back, you know, I'm really glad I got sick. But I do think that, this is, you know, one of the essays it turns out I wrote was really about the importance of illness to Thoreau himself, because going to Walden really followed his brother's death from lockjaw and his own sympathetic case of lockjaw. and the death of Emerson's young son, Waldo. And I think these were facts of life in the mid-19th century, the presence of illness, of serious illness, the potential for death, that I think we tend to feel in the, gosh, I was about to say the late 20th century. In the 21st century, I think we kind of feel we outgrew those, especially given living in a world of medical miracles, organ transplants, technology. And I think that one of the things that I really was forced to come back to, in both in being ill and in writing about illness, and this I think too reflects on Thoreau, though in complicated ways for Thoreau, is being a body. So much of earlier American autobiography, I'm thinking, of Franklin, for example, is so cerebral, so ideological. And I think Thoreau's presence in his body, and I think of some of his writers like Annie Dillard in the 20th century, really in the 20th century, writing about being, in a 3-page essay about being faced on a riverbank by a weasel, locking eyes with a weasel, realizing how connected human beings are to the animal world and to the world of wildness. I think in that way, and I think Thoreau marks the beginning of so much of that. Most of my own critical writing has actually been about Henry Adams, and I see that so little of that has lived through into this work, a little of it. And I do think in Henry Adams' education that the turning point in the book is his facing his sister's death also from lockjaw, the moment at which Adams was forced to be so present emotionally. And so I think illness is a key issue there as well. But I think that the presence of the secular movement of time and the insistent presence of the physical and of the wild is one of the things that I keep coming back to in Thoreau. More than I ever, certainly, and this is one of the things I think I've learned from this kind of writing, without any intention of seeking out these connections.
I think I don't think you're all that far from Henry Adams in the sense that you sure know how to write a sentence, and that's something that's evident in that first book, the quality of the prose, which mirrors the quality of the prose that it's writing about. But what about works like Virginia Woolf's book on illness or Susan Sontag? One would think if there are precedents, maybe it's in that neighborhood that one should look. And I'm just wondering if you came to these American authors sort of inevitably and half-consciously, or whether you had a sense that these were models for what you wanted to do, or whether you saw no models at all for what you were attempting.
I've read so much writing on illness, and this is now a time in which writing about illness, it's kind of, I think it's just as this is, someone else has said, this is the golden age of the essay. I think this has been the golden age of writing about illness. And I also think even before COVID, that the sort of belated discovery by American writers that they are bodies is part of this, not just, ideas about success and about change and about momentum, but the ways in which the body is so present and often not allowing a certain kind of momentum. So I think I've learned a lot, especially from, I think both Woolf and Sontag write very close to their thinking as they write is the distance between those who are ill and those who are not ill. The difficulty of those who are not ill to understand what illness means. And I think especially in this case of Sontag's binary between the kingdom of the sick and the kingdom of the well. And I must say that I do think that chronic illness calls that binary into question, because I think that those two kingdoms, their boundaries cross a lot and keep crossing for the chronically ill. I mean, I think this is an ongoing concern for Sontag, who can understand what. I know, of course, Sontag understands all, but I think that, and I think this is one of the reasons why chronic illness is so vexing in the medical profession, is because it doesn't give way. You know, it doesn't cooperate with a linear trajectory or even a trajectory of healing, because it remains, everything remains mysterious when it might come back. You know, I should add for myself, you know, this isn't something I think about so much anymore, and I don't know if it will ever come back, but I do think that that binary is one which I find myself really questioning. And I think, you know, living in the last 9 months, 10 months through whatever it is that we're living through, I know it's not done yet. Feeling illness is so much a part of our lives. There is a way in which that is a reminder of, you know, of the presence of illness as something that is not necessarily, we think of healing, we think of wellness as normalcy. But I think that illness isn't an anomaly. You know, I think it is a really deep part of human life. And of course, for the chronically ill, it makes very visible. I think chronic illness in this sense is a kind of truth teller that brings to the surface the fact that illness is always there. You know, that potential is always there. And although we might not wish for it, and although it can be tragic, it is also a part of the bodies that we have and the lives that we live. You know, it's not something that we can make either leave the hospital and as the kingdom of the ill and walk back into the kingdom of the well, and it's not quite there. And I'm simplifying Sontag also, but I do think that that binary is not nearly as neat under the conditions of chronic illness. And by the way, let's face it, so much of the world we live in is defined now by chronic illness. You know, cancer clearly, I think we are talking about as a chronic illness, you know, and that is, I have no choice but to call this a chronic illness, but I think it takes a certain amount of, it's not nice to think about an illness as not going away. It's not passing us, not using the word, you can't use the word TTP survivor, but maybe we shouldn't be using the word cancer survivor either. I don't know. It's not from me to judge not being a cancer patient. But anyway, that's what I would say. I think that certainly I've read a lot of writing about illness that I've so admired. So many essays, Eula Biss's essay about pain, so many works, Richard McCann's work about his liver transplant. All of these are, I think, works that really call into question the linearity of narrative and the ability to settle the questions of illness, and they've been very strong influences on me.
Where do you think this work figures in the development of your overall project as a writer, starting with Adams and getting to this point?
Yeah, that's an easier question. As I thought about it a bit, I realized it was an easier question to answer about thinking about my memoir about growing up in the suburbs in the 50s and 60s, where my body was very much a part of that. I do think that, you know, the turning point of Adams as illness, around illness really shows as an interesting parallel. But I also kind of see this going forward. The next project that I've started, which as I thought about it, looks back to Adams in ways I wouldn't have necessarily first recognized, is probably a long essay about gardens. My parents were obviously both gardeners, and I've never had a garden, but it turns out as I went back and looked at some of my other work, all of it talks about gardens. And really the kind of, particularly the projection in the post-World War II suburb of the garden as this DIY projection of being master of your own fate. And also of the place within certain boundaries within which control and vision and some kind of ideal might be created and sustained. And I thought back so much of what I wrote about in Adams, about in thinking about the letter as a form, has to do also with that kind of boundary making. And I think also in ways that are, I'm not quite sure what to do with yet, but the garden is also one of those forms that is both very much an elite form. You think about so many gardens are really the projection of state power, of authority. Obviously the gardens at Versailles, but even some of the gardens in Central Park where you see kind of projected a way of being in the world. But then the garden is also the most, I don't know, the most earthy, the place where people plant their own stuff, where stuff can grow also, where anyone can do it. And I think the letter is one of those forms that also in interesting ways is at all those boundaries. I mean, I think Henry Adams' letters clearly became for him a place to sustain a very protected, private world of exchange. And yet they were for Whitman, for example, a way to extend out to anyone the opportunity to be a writer, or at least so Whitman presented them in what he said to his correspondence. And I think that's very interesting as well.
Well, for what it's worth, my sense is that that Adams remains important to you in lots of different ways, including the garden stuff, which you discover as the alternative to being in the shadow of the State House in his work. And if I were to read you in relation to Adams, this hadn't occurred to me before, but the Hunger Artist book about a suburban childhood is about not being born in the shadow of the Boston State House. How about this? As a kind of alternative claim for an American life. And so, I mean, it does seem to me that, and that book, of course, is much more sociological in certain ways in what it records than Every Last Breath, which is has all of those details, but sees in them really cosmic implications in the transcendentalist way.
And you're totally right. Now that I think about it, I think back to those earliest chapters. You know, like in some ways the most powerful, the most evocative of Adams' chapters, where he contrasts the world of Beverly, Massachusetts, the Adams world, and the sensuality of that world. What the difference between summer on the coast at the Adams, in the Adams family, and winter in the banks of, and money of his mother's family. And then I think also too, Adams's fascination with, I also think that, that his writing about the Virgin and the Dynamo is also some of his most beautiful writing. And his recognition of being pulled into a world of larger forces. I think I'm struck by the fact that as I've now been, writing for a bit, doing this kind of writing, about a sense that these are subjects, unexpected subjects that I feel have called out of me some of my favorite writing.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't have expected, about birds. There's like 6 places where monarch butterflies appear in both Hunger Artist and here, and birds and bird migration. And I'm struck, and that I think So I think, and in some ways there was something in that same way, thinking about Adams at the Universal Exposition and his reaction to the Corliss engines there, and the way that flung him into thinking about history moving faster. That has, I think, some of those same qualities. So sometimes, I guess I've learned in doing that you don't always know where you're going. I didn't think I wouldn't, I said to you the other day, I would never in a million years have thought of myself as a nature writer. But then it turns out, I think a lot of my deepest heart in this work is there. In those correspondences between the physical world, the forces of the physical world, the movement, the idea of homing and migration, took me into a place I never would have expected as a writer.
Well, I think this is a time we should let other people ask some questions of you. I have a lot more that I'd like to talk with you about, but there are others waiting, and I would value hearing what they had to say. I'm sure you would too.
We actually had some questions submitted ahead of time, which I'd like to ask real quick. First question, when you finished the book, you had no idea it would be released during a pandemic. How has the experience
I know. No. I'm teasing.
How has the experience of living through a pandemic impacted your thinking about illness in general and your thinking about your vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that, I happen to think that that things did not have to go the way they have gone in the US. And I don't mind saying that the US has made a royal mess of dealing with the pandemic. However, I would also say that I think that, that I think this pandemic is also a reminder that of vulnerability, of the fact that illness is a part of modern life. I think one of the things the pandemic has done in the US in particular is kind of call into question our own modernity. Like, what happened to our hospitals? What happened to our ability to, to dispense medicine? In that way, I think it brings us back, whatever one's political position might be, to the fact that illness is not a function of modernity. It is something that brings us back to our bodies and is with us. I think about the fact that, early on in the pandemic in New York, a field hospital was put up in Central Park in front of Mount Sinai Hospital. And it was such an eerie sight to see the boundary between the world of leisure and the boundaried world of gardens, to have a hospital extended into that space, or to see the Javits Center, this big commercial center made into a military hospital. And that, I think, echoes back to the Civil War, which was the beginning of the field hospital, and this interpenetration between daily life, the life we think of as healthy, well, and a reminder of those kinds of fragility, how unprepared we were for psychically either for having that be part of our lives in such a powerful way. And I think that's separate from the question, should people keep going to super spreader events? I have an opinion about that. But I think even no matter what, I think that the presence of a pandemic and the scale that it implies reminds us that, that in some ways illness is not the anomaly over time. So I would say that would be one answer I would give.
Great, thank you. So how do you think chronic illness affects the sense of time?
Well, I think for me, it has, Well, in some ways it's taken me out of time, in the sense that let me put it that differently. It's taken me out of the time that I used to know. And particularly as a writer and a critic of autobiography, I think until the last 10 or 20 years, pardon me, for the most part, American autobiography has been driven by a linear narrative, a forward-moving narrative, the idea of change, that you start, Benjamin Franklin comes from Puritan Boston and gets off in Philadelphia, and he doesn't have any idea what's going on. He walks up to the bakery. He doesn't really know how to buy bread. He buys these 3 great puffy rolls, and he's walking awkwardly up the street in Philadelphia, really, unprepared. But that scene gets set as a touchstone against which momentum for the rest of the autobiography is marked. That becomes a benchmark point. And I think that chronic illness really cannot conform to that linearity, to that, to that relationship between narrative and time. And I think that's partly why I've found myself coming back in so many places to imagery of cycles, of birds migrating, of snakes shedding their skin. I think to be wedded to that kind of time and have a chronic illness seems to me really self-hurtful, actually, because that's not what's going to happen. I don't think that's a tragedy, by the way, but I think that it can be tragic to be constantly pushed by that sense of time against something that's not going to be. So I'd say that would be, yeah.
Great, I got one more. This person would like to ask you if plasma exchange is ever done prophylactically to control TTP.
I don't think there's any reason for it to be. So, as we say in my family, I'm not a real doctor, but no one actually knows. I mean, once you have an episode of TTP and your platelets return to the proper level, you might not have anyone. You might never have it again. Plasmapheresis is actually pretty invasive, to have your jugular opened and then have all of your blood taken out, centrifuged, recirculated so that the rogue plasma is centrifuged out and replaced by donor plasma is actually pretty invasive. I don't think while I was having it, I was quite grasping how invasive it is. It really doesn't hurt very much, I should say, but having all your blood taken out, it's your body doesn't want you to. So I don't think there is much prophylaxis in that respect. However, there are a couple of medications. When I had a relapse, I had a sort of I had an infusion called Rituxan used quarterly for about a year till things settled down, and I haven't had to have it since. So I think I've been super, super, super lucky. There are people who have to be pheresed many times, twice a day in the hospital, a 3-hour procedure, and then have to come back. And then some of the medications they end up using make them vulnerable to other diseases, or they don't live in a city where TTP gets recognized right away. Mount Sinai in New York was the first place where it was actually described. And I think that's one of the things that often holds things up for people. But I've been super lucky in that respect. I've responded to things. And so it's not, to my knowledge, it's not used prophylactically.
Great. That's all the questions we had submitted, but we had a lot of people say, go Joanne, and wish you luck.
That's good.
If anybody has another question, you feel free to ask it now.
No question, but go Jojo. We loved it. We love you. We love Ellen. We love the whole family. And we're so proud. We're so like feeling the aura and loving it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Sabrina.
I have a question.
Okay. Yes, Susan, and I think I saw one from Yael. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Joanne, you said that the US is handling the pandemic in the worst way. What countries do you think are handling it well or correctly?
I think Germany has handled it much better than we have.
In what sense?
I think they've acknowledged that what's happening. They've had, I mean, I think we needed a national response. You know, I think that viruses really don't work by maps. So they're not that interested in the boundary between Illinois and Indiana. I think that a virus on this level is one that needs to be dealt with at a national level. And I do think most European countries are more comfortable doing that than the US.
Yes.
I think there's some disadvantages to that centralized authority, which I could see in, the education system in France, for example. But when it comes to something like this, where you do need to recognize, that would be one thing, it seems to me. I mean, just completely on its own. So I mean, having said that, I want to say with a little more humility, it's good that I was not put on on any of the big committees, because I don't really have a lot of expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Joanne,
I have a
Lucy.
question.
I wanted to ask you something about the book. When you were writing it, how aware was your mother that you were writing it, and did she of it?
That is a great question. So the book before this was also turned out to be a lot about my mom. So when I started writing this, my mom said, "What are you writing about now?" And she said, "I really hope it's not me." And no, it's not you. And then I kept writing. I really didn't know I was writing a book, to be honest. I knew I was writing some present tense essays about my mom's illness and trying to see what that might be. But after writing 3 or 4 of the essays, I started to feel kind of crummy. I was at a writer's retreat outside Chicago, and it happens that one of the people I was friends with there was a bioethicist named Katie Watson, and I asked her to go to lunch with me and talk about whether I could keep writing, what was ethical. And she said, well, it's not ethical to keep. She didn't seem to feel it was much of a gray area, that it wasn't ethical to keep writing about my mother and lying about it. So I sat my mother down. I told her this is what I'm doing. I asked her if she would be willing to read the work. And I also said that she said, if I tell you I don't want you to do it anymore, will you stop? And I said, I might, but better if you would read it first and hopefully not say that. So she read it and we sat down, and a lot of this had been written by then, the stuff about my mom. And she said she thought that she's fine with my continuing. She said, actually, that line that I used at the beginning of Mirror Writing, she said she thinks that I'm much sadder about my mortality than she is, that she really doesn't think about it. She thinks I think about it a lot more than she does. And she thinks that's my story, that a lot of what I'm writing about her, I thought this was, Lucy, you know my mother very well, so like me, you might be surprised by this, but she said, I think this is much more about you than you think. And then she said that she really didn't want the place she's living described as a retirement home because it's really independent living. Okay, so that was it. But yeah, so I think, I mean, I think that is a really huge ethical question, writing about somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And I had written about my mother in the previous book, and in fact, there had been this scene where she and her sister were abused by a cousin, and I asked her how she felt about my writing. Well, it hadn't really occurred to me not to include it, and Ellen said, I think that's not your story to tell. So I did go to my mother and say, how do you feel about my including this? And she said, not that great, but she said, if you think it's going to make your book better, I'll think about it overnight. So, and then she thought about it overnight. She came back the next day. She said, if you think this is going to make your book better, you can keep it. But she said, take my sister out of it because you don't have her permission. So, okay, that was interesting. And I did. And if my mother had told me to take that out, I would have. That really wasn't my story. Of course, I didn't notice that till someone else pointed it out. But, I saw a couple of other questions.
I have a related
yeah.
question on what you just said. First of all, I always find your writing sheer poetry, Joanne. And what has impressed me both with Hunger Artist and Every Last Breath is just what you were talking about, your willingness to share incredible intimacy about your life, your thoughts, and your feelings, sometimes almost painfully raw. What process do you go through to reach that deep into yourself to be able to do that and give it to us?
So that took me a long time, you know. I mean, I'd say the first essay I wrote, which Stephen Donadio published, about my father reading, took me about 5 years to write that one essay, and I wasn't very comfortable with that. I don't know. I think I think partly I always, and in this, Stephen, you'd asked earlier about models. I think Joan Didion has been a very important model for me as an essayist, partly because she's so grounded in specificity. And I think I have always started with a scene, not with an idea. And I think over time I've learned that I kind of just recognize that there's something in a scene that's going to be powerful. And I start there and kind of work from the inside on that. So I think that's opened a lot of things up for me, is working that way. And it's something I've admired so much about Didion, is her ability to honor almost so much specificity and almost the randomness of a lot of specificity that sort of slowly accrues until you realize it's not that random. And I know that's not just, Whitman wrote in his letters, oh, just write till write and write, you don't think about things, just like me, and many drafts of those letters survive. So that was obviously a fiction, but I don't think that Didion's just a crude, she's such a hyper stylist, but I think in that respect, I think you often find out what's there for you, and it deepens once you get into a scene that in your heart is going to be important. Utah people, do you need to go?
I was just going to say we have some more questions in the chat, which I will send to you, Joanne, and you can respond to them.
Okay. Stephen, are we at the end here? Stephen, did you want to say something?
I do. I just want to emphasize that that this is not a collection of essays. This is a book. And that the individual parts of this seem to me less like essays than like letters. I think the idea of the letters has been important to you from the beginning of your career. And letters, in the case of Adams, as a way of creating community.
I think you're right.
If you think about the situation of one's being in a kind of inviolable isolation, the only way out of that is to create a community through communication. And that very word in its Latin roots means to share or to make something common. And I think one of the things that's at the center of this book is the recognition of what we have in common, which is unavoidably our mortality. This is a book very much about mortality, impatience with mortality, resignation to mortality, struggles with mortality. That's really why it's not just about you, but it's about all of us. And it seems to me that that's the common burden that we bear, sometimes surprisingly lightly in certain moods, and sometimes extraordinarily heavily, and, you know, as this book makes clear. And what strikes me is that this is a book that looks at that unavoidable fact with kind of unfailing lucidity, but never with even a trace of sentimentality or pleading for the sympathy of the reader. That's the kind of integrity that it has, and it manages somehow to summon a kind of a deep generosity, which it seems to me we all owe one another under these trying and inescapable circumstances. That's what is, to me, a remarkable and enduring achievement about this book. And unlike a lot of noisy but ultimately empty contemporary productions, of which there are many, this is a book that will come to mean a lot to any reader who encounters it. And I would say to everyone, after you've read it once, you won't want to part with it. And I thank you for writing it. We all do.
As usual, I think you've kind of managed to articulate many of the things that have mattered most to me about writing this and that are closest to my heart and my hopes for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I echo your sentiments completely. I guess at this time, I would just like to thank everyone for coming, for being here, to congratulate Joanne on her book. And we are going to put the reading up on our YouTube channel, so you're welcome to check that out if you want to relive this. And any final words, Joanne?
Well, thank you, really. I think the conversation, the exchange between Stephen and me just there was really so close to what I hope for, for this book. And I'm very grateful for everything that you've done, Jenilyn, for making sure that it really came to have a life. So thanks so much. And thanks to the press also for hosting this launch.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And have a good evening.
You too.
Good job.
Congratulations.
Oh yeah, unmute to clap, everybody. Yay, Joanne! Yay.